Even when I was little, I felt a deep affection for the northern woods. It began when my parents took us on a sudden spring break to a family cabin owned by my grandparents. I was enchanted. The secluded cabin, the vast fields I could run through all day. It was magical. That cabin felt like my sanctuary, a place where everything was awe-inspiring and beautiful until a few years ago. In 2018, after my partner and I had been together for 5 years, we finally got married. That's when my parents gave us some surprising news. They would be selling us the cabin. Just days after deciding to spend our honeymoon there, we were already boarding a flight to our new home in northern woods. The familiar crunch of gravel under our rental car's tires woke me from a nap, and my husband, Mike, gave a low whistle, amazed by the surrounding land. "Wow, you weren't exaggerating. This place is amazing," he said, grinning. I laughed and replied, "When will you learn I'm always right?" He parked, and as soon as the car doors unlocked, I was out, breathing in the fresh air. We grabbed our bags, and I dashed up the stairs, suitcase thumping behind me. "Hurry up, Slowpoke. Our honeymoon awaits," I teased. Mike just chuckled, shaking his head. "Lena, I love you, but we both know you couldn't care less about the honeymoon right now. You just want to get inside and soak in those childhood memories." I rolled my eyes, taking the keys from his hand. "Are you calling me old?" I joked, unlocking the door. Inside, the cabin was dusty, with furniture covered in cloths. No one had been here since my grandparents passed years ago. But despite the dust, it was just as beautiful as I remembered, feeling like home. "It needs a bit of cleaning, but it's perfect," I smiled at Mike as I hugged him. The month we spent there was mostly peaceful and filled with some light cleaning and relaxation. About halfway through, we learned we were expecting a baby. A surprise, but a joyous one. That was one reason Mike left the night of my first encounter with something strange. My cravings had kicked in, so he kindly drove the long hour to town to grab me snacks. I stayed behind, dozing off on the couch as the TV played softly. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the door. At first, I thought it was from the TV, but I soon realized someone was pounding on the front door. I've always had a fear of being alone at night, though I've never been able to explain why. My heart pounded, and my mind raced for explanations. Maybe a neighbor? But we were the only ones for miles. Maybe Mike had forgotten his keys. Then I heard his voice calling, "Lena, let me in." But it sounded wrong, cold and gravelly, unlike Mike's usual warm tone. He had never sounded like that before. I was frozen, unable to move, tears streaming as I stayed curled up in terror. When the pounding stopped, I thought it was over, but then I heard scratching outside, nearing the living room. I realized in horror I'd forgotten to close the curtains. As the scratching grew closer, I hid under my blanket, feeling like a scared child again. Then a sharp tap on the window followed. I heard a voice, taunting, "I see you." It sounded nothing like Mike, almost demonic. I felt as if I was living a nightmare, knowing that whatever was out there wasn't human. As I was on the brink of breaking down, I heard keys at the door. Mike was finally home, but the creature was still there growling. I pulled the blanket down, the light blinding me as I saw Mike's puzzled look. "What are you doing, Goof?" he asked, but his smile dropped when he saw how shaken I was. He held me close as I sobbed, and I told him what happened. Though I left out how it mimicked his voice, I didn't think he'd believe me. The police came, but they found no one. However, they reported deep scratch marks on the cabin wall outside, near the living room window. Despite this incident, we decided to move into the cabin with some added security, a new gate, cameras, even firearms for protection. Strange things continued, like eerie screeches in the woods and dead animals near the house, but nothing like that night. Years passed, and we started a family. Our daughter Clara, born shortly after that incident, and a younger son, Jake. One evening, while I was at work, Mike called me, sounding frantic. He asked where I was. Confused, I told him I was still at work, but he insisted, "No, you're outside." My heart sank. The creature was back, now terrorizing my family. I grabbed my keys, told my boss I had to leave, and sped home, the kids crying in the background on the phone. The drive felt agonizingly long, but eventually I reached the gate. I knew the creature was out there, watching me, but I had to open the gate manually. I was terrified, my hands shaking, but I forced myself to get out. Mike was on the phone, urging me to stay in the car, and soon I saw his truck pulling up. We both drove to a nearby gas station, where we reunited, hugging tightly. That night will stay with us forever. Now we're staying in a temporary rental, deciding if we'll stay in the area or move. I researched what we might have encountered, and the closest matches I found were a Wendigo or Skinwalker, though no one can say for sure. Whatever it was, it turned a once idyllic place into a nightmare that will haunt us always. This story is set in rural Washington, a place where fires have swept through the landscape over the past few years. My brothers and I were heading to our family's land to tend the garden. We planned to stay up in the mountains for a week or so, hoping to escape the busyness of city life and spend time reconnecting, as we hadn't been especially close over the years. I was 18 at the time, eager to get away to relax, fire off some rounds, and share some beers with my brothers, hoping to bridge the age gap between us. It was a Thursday when we packed up my brother's lifted Ford F-150 with guns, food, fishing gear, and a stash of whiskey and beer. After grabbing lunch, we headed for the garden on a quiet road off the main path. The road became gravel as we climbed, eventually reaching an old helipad near the top, though I never knew why it was there. Around an hour later, we finally arrived at the place we called our garden retreat, a little home away from home in the woods. I loved this property because of the freedom it gave me. The only structures were a newer cabin my brother had built, plus a few other outbuildings for cooking, bathing, and storage. The first few days were perfect, tending the garden, sharing drinks, and exploring the old logging roads by truck. I was having a blast. On the fourth day, a nearby resident stopped by. Let's call him Carl. Carl was an older man with a typical mountain man look, weathered and very private. He valued his peace and quiet out there in the wild with his dogs. I met Carl, and then my older brother asked me to fetch our other brother so they could all talk with him. When I got back, Carl was warning my brothers to be cautious of a cougar, as sightings were common here. One had attacked his oldest dog, Lucy, recently, so he wanted us to be aware. After Carl left, my brothers had a private talk, and later over dinner, I learned we'd be out looking for that mountain lion the next morning since my brother had a hunting tag for it. We had a few drinks and called it a night early. The next morning at 3 a.m., my brothers were up and ready, just waiting for me to join them. I showered, sprayed my clothes with scent blocker, grabbed my hunting rifle, had a quick coffee and cigarette, and we set off. My brothers knew the land well, having been up there for years, so I followed along, picking up tracking tips from them. After about an hour of hiking, we arrived at a spring-fed pool, which my brothers said served as a watering spot for wildlife in the dry summer months. We set up 2 blinds about 200 yards away, the wind blowing toward us, a great spot for waiting. With snacks and coffee, we settled in as daylight approached. When dawn finally broke, my brother used his rangefinder on the spring and confirmed we were at a perfect distance. My rifle was sighted to cover that range, so I felt ready. We quietly talked about Carl and his poor dog, not noticing when a raccoon crept to the water's edge. But we quickly noticed it darted away, spooked by something. We exchanged looks, thinking it was odd for a raccoon to bolt like that. Moments later, something unfamiliar emerged from the brush and moved toward the pool. None of us had ever seen anything like it before. It resembled a wolf, but had a huge, square head, almost like a bulldog, and back legs more like a deer's. We watched in silence, barely daring to breathe. Then suddenly it looked straight at us. My brother raised his .30-06 in an instant but held off shooting. I wondered how it knew where we were. We hadn't made any noise, and the wind was in our favor, so it shouldn't have smelled us. Just then, it opened its mouth and made a strange, squealing sound like a loud, high-pitched scratch. Fear surged through me as I raised my rifle, barely able to steady it. My brothers were ready too, but before we could react, the creature let out a shriek like a malfunctioning siren, then darted back into the woods. My oldest brother mumbled something I couldn't hear, and we sat in silence for another hour before heading back. On the way back to the cabin, my brother told us that when he'd looked through the rangefinder, he'd seen it show its teeth sharp like those of a big cat. Whatever it was, it clearly had the instincts of a predator. Back at the cabin, we decided to stop by Carl's and tell him about what we'd seen. Carl listened, then shared an old story about a shapeshifter from native folklore. He said that when he first moved here, a strange creature that looked like a deer but wasn't would shriek in the night. He'd only seen it twice, but it was enough to know it wasn't an ordinary animal. He hadn't seen it in decades but figured we might have. He warned us to stay alert and handed us some of his homemade brew as we left. Back at the cabin, I was still rattled by what we'd experienced. After Carl's story, I didn't know what to think about those woods anymore. The rest of our stay was quiet, except for a raccoon startling one of my brothers in the bathhouse, but the memory of that creature lingered. So, if you ever hear an eerie shriek in the mountains near Kendrick, remember our encounter and be careful. Every year, my close friend Drew and I go down to visit his grandparents at their cabin in a quiet, small town in the North Carolina mountains. My friend, his grandpa, and I are all outdoorsy people, so we're always looking for something exciting to do in the area. One evening, we decided to go on a night hike along a trail not far from the cabin. This wasn't your typical trail. It was more of a gravelly, dirt road popular among hunters, campers, and backpackers. As we pulled up to the trail, we noticed an old, beat-up black Chevy SUV with two middle-aged men inside parked near the entrance. While this is usually a safe area, shady folks and questionable activities sometimes occur in the deep woods, so we chose to avoid this trail and head to another one about a half-mile down the road. We parked about 50 feet into the second trail, just out of view from the main road, then got out to start our hike. Everything was going smoothly until we were about a mile in, and then we heard a dog barking, seemingly around 300 feet away. We decided to keep going, but the barking wouldn't stop, not knowing if the dog was free or if it might approach us aggressively. We decided to turn back. When we were about 1,000 feet from the truck, we noticed a car idling behind Drew's grandpa's truck with its headlights on. This was instantly alarming. Who would just pull up behind a random truck at 10 p.m. on an isolated trail? Keep in mind, you'd have to drive into the trail to see where we parked, as the truck wasn't visible from the road. We waited there for about 5 minutes, trying to see if we could spot anyone, but it was too dark and too far away to make anything out. Luckily, there was a large tree near the trail, so we were able to hide behind it, making it impossible for them to spot us. Drew's grandpa used the night vision binoculars we had, but they didn't reveal much either. We decided to just stay hidden and wait for them to turn around, as there was no way we were going to approach the truck with some strange car parked behind it. After standing there for about 10 minutes, to my horror, the car drove around the truck and started down the trail in our direction. As quickly as we could, we scrambled up a hill next to the trail and hid behind a log at the top. Moments later, that same old black Chevy SUV from outside the first trail rolled right by where we had been standing only seconds before. The windows were rolled down, and they slowed down as they passed. I could feel my heart racing. We were absolutely terrified they would stop, get out, or worse, start searching for us. Thankfully, they kept driving and didn't stop. Once they were out of sight, we got out of our hiding spot and sprinted back to the truck, getting out of there as fast as possible. This may not be the scariest story to some, but for us, it was nerve-wracking. We never figured out who those guys were or what they wanted. My guess is they had something hidden further down that trail and thought we'd found it, or they were out there for some other reason. A lot of things could have gone wrong that night. What if we'd reached the trail a few seconds later and they saw us? What if they'd confronted us? Or if they'd slashed the truck tires or waited quietly for us to come back? If we'd been just a little later getting out of there, we might have been noticed by some very dangerous people. It was the beginning of autumn, and I had rented a small, quiet cabin deep in the forests of Japan's hidden mountains. The rain had been pouring down non-stop for hours, hammering the roof and drowning out any other sounds. I was completely alone, far from the nearest village, surrounded only by thick woods, wet earth, and the never-ending hum of rain. The cabin was simple. Just one small room with an old futon on the floor, a tiny kitchen, and a few flickering candles. The power was unreliable here, and the storm had finally knocked it out completely, leaving me with just a single flashlight, which seemed to be getting weaker every minute. The wind outside was strong, bending the trees so they creaked and groaned, while branches scraped against the walls with an uneven tapping. The night felt darker than usual, like the rain was pressing in from all sides, making it hard to focus on anything but the heavy, endless downpour. Yet, at some point, a strange feeling washed over me, an uncomfortable sense that I wasn't really alone. I couldn't explain it, just a tightness in my chest like someone was there silently watching. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just nervous from being out here by myself in the middle of a raging storm. Still, I found myself glancing toward the windows, squinting into the shadows, but all I could see was my faint reflection against the dark glass. Each time I looked back at the flashlight or the flickering candles, I'd feel an odd pull to glance over my shoulder, as though something might be lurking just out of sight. After a while, I realized the rain wasn't pounding as hard, though the storm still rumbled on. I felt a little relieved, but at the same time, a new uneasiness crept in, like I'd been holding my breath without realizing it. And then, just as the rain eased a bit, I heard something that made my stomach drop. A crunching sound, soft but unmistakable, just outside the cabin. It sounded like gravel under a boot. I strained to listen, heart pounding, but the noise was gone, lost in the wind and the occasional splash of rain. I told myself it might have been a falling branch or some animal passing by, but something about it didn't sit right. I kept still, barely breathing, listening for any other sounds, But all I heard was the rustling trees and the steady drip of rain sliding off the roof. Then I heard it again, footsteps slow and careful, this time coming closer to the cabin door. However, it was seemed to be moving with purpose, as though they didn't want to be heard. My heartbeat felt like it was echoing off the walls, but I forced myself to stay still, waiting every part of me on high alert. The steps stopped right outside the door. I sat in the darkness, every instinct telling me not to move a muscle. I waited, but there was no knock, no voice, no movement. Just silence. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours, and then, slowly, I heard the footsteps start to back away. I didn't move until the sound had faded completely, swallowed once again by the storm. I waited even longer, gripping my flashlight tightly, until I felt certain I was alone again, though sleep was out of the question. I sat in silence, heart racing, until I finally saw the faint light of dawn through the window. As the first light crept through, I cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. The ground was covered in wet leaves, and the air was cold and damp. But as I turned toward the narrow path that led back to the village, my stomach turned cold. There, clearly visible in the mud, was a single line of deep footprints leading straight up to my door. They were large, too large to be mine, pressed perfectly into the wet earth. And they didn't just lead to the cabin. They led to my window. A chill ran through me as I looked more closely. The footprint stopped at my window and then continued to the door. Someone, or something, had been right there, looking in at me while I sat in the darkness. They had been close enough to watch, close enough to listen. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the footprints in the mud. As I looked back at the empty, silent woods, it was as if the trees were holding a secret, something they wouldn't tell. Whoever it was had walked away into the forest, leaving no sign of where they'd gone, as if they'd just melted back into the shadows. As I packed my things, I kept glancing over my shoulder, every creak and rustle putting me on edge. I knew I wouldn't be returning to that cabin. Whoever had come that night hadn't knocked, hadn't tried to come inside. They had simply stood there, watching from the dark, waiting. And that was somehow worse than anything else, knowing that someone had been there, listening in the silence, and that they could be waiting out there again, just beyond the trees, hidden from view. The cabin sat deep in the mountains, far from any town, and served as a lonely outpost on the border. It was a small, simple space, just one room with a rough bed, a little wood stove, a small table, and a radio that worked only when it felt like it. I've been assigned to stay there for a few weeks, keeping watch for anything suspicious crossing the border. The place was cold, quiet, and surrounded by thick trees, making me feel like I was hidden away from the world. The cabin was old and creaked a lot, with cold air slipping through the gaps in the walls. At night, the temperature dropped fast, and the only sound for miles around was the wind tearing through the trees. I kept the radio on most of the time, hoping for any voice or noise to break the silence that hung over me like a heavy blanket. Most nights, though, it was nothing but static. One night, the cold was sharper than usual, and a thick fog had settled in, making it hard to see anything outside. The air felt heavy, pressing against the cabin, and I found myself getting up over and over to look out the windows, squinting into the darkness and the mist. The trees were dark, shifting shapes that looked closer than they should. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the fog, watching me. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint crunch like something stepping on frozen leaves. Footsteps. They were slow and heavy, moving around somewhere outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but the steps had a steady rhythm, too careful to be a wandering deer or bear. I moved closer to the window, trying to see past the fog and shadows, but there was nothing there, only darkness. The footsteps kept getting closer, pausing and then starting again, as if whoever was out there was trying to stay hidden. I thought about grabbing the rifle, but I wasn't even sure what I was dealing with. My heart was racing, and I felt a tightness in my chest, like my body knew something was wrong before I did. I stayed by the window, hoping the sounds would just fade away, but the footsteps kept circling the cabin, like someone was examining every side of it. The thought of that made my skin crawl. Then, as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. I waited, listening to my own heart pounding in my ears, trying to convince myself it was just my nerves playing tricks. But the quiet didn't last. A few moments later, I heard a soft scratching sound from the back of the cabin, just below the window near my bed. At first, it was faint, almost like an animal digging around, but soon it grew louder, more deliberate, as if something was trying to break in. I didn't move, barely even breathe, as the scratching went on, scraping against the wood. I felt rooted to the spot, afraid to even turn on the light, worried that it would let whoever was outside know exactly where I was. After what felt like hours, the scratching finally stopped, replaced by more footsteps, this time at the front of the cabin. Whoever it was seemed to be pacing, as though they were waiting for something, testing my nerves, seeing how long I could stay calm. I didn't sleep at all that night, standing by the window with my hand gripping the rifle, eyes fixed on the darkness, half expecting a face to appear against the glass at any moment. But no one showed. I didn't move, didn't even blink, just listened as the footsteps finally faded away and the night dragged on. When dawn finally came, and the first light started breaking through the fog, I stepped outside, every nerve still tense. The ground was covered in frost, leaves crackling under my boots. And then I saw them, deep footprints in the frozen mud, circling the cabin, clear as day. The tracks led away from the cabin, heading back toward the dense trees. They were too large to be mine, too precise to be random. I followed them just to the edge of the woods, where the trees closed in and the shadows stretched longer, even in the daylight. It was then I noticed a piece of torn cloth caught on a low branch, dirty and stained with something dark. I wasn't sure if it was mud or something else. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the forest, feeling that same eerie sense of being watched. Whoever had come to the cabin had been close enough to touch it, close enough to look inside. I never found out who or what it was that visited me that night. As I made my way back inside, I could still feel the weight of the silence around me, as if the forest itself was hiding something just out of sight, something waiting. I closed the door, locked it, and hoped it would keep whatever was out there at bay. But deep down, I knew a flimsy lock wouldn't stop it if it decided to come back. And I had the feeling it would. I'd rented a small, old cabin for a few nights, hoping to get some peace and quiet. It was pretty far out, surrounded by thick woods, and just beyond the cabin was a clearing with an overgrown graveyard. The gravestones looked ancient, most of the names worn off with time. I noticed it when I pulled up, but didn't think much of it. Just seemed like something you'd find way out here, a forgotten place nobody visited anymore. The cabin itself was simple, a bit run down but sturdy. Just a bed, a chair, a wood stove. The lights worked, but the wiring seemed off. Whenever the wind blew, the lights would flicker. I spent the first day exploring the trails around the area, trying to settle in. When night came, the wind picked up, and the cabin started to make all these creaks and groans. I told myself it was just the wood shifting, but it made the place feel even more unsettling, especially with that graveyard nearby. There was something about the darkness here, like it was pressing in on the cabin. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake this feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept tossing and turning, and finally, I got up hoping a quick walk would calm me down. I threw on my jacket, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside into the cold night. The wind had calmed, leaving a strange, heavy silence in its place. I could barely see the graveyard, just some pale gravestones barely visible through the trees. I don't know why, but I felt this pull like I needed to go closer, to take a look. I walked over, stepping carefully on the damp ground, the flashlight casting shaky beams across the stones. Most of the names were too worn to read, but then, just as I was about to turn back, my flashlight caught something odd. Near one of the newer graves, partly hidden by dirt, was a shape that didn't belong. I moved closer, my heart pounding, and realized it was a body. A man's body, slumped over and half buried. He was lying face down, his clothes dirty and worn. He'd been there a while, but he hadn't been buried in the grave. He was just left there, right next to it, like someone had dragged him out and left him beside the grave. I took a step back, my whole body tense. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? How did he end up here, in this lonely graveyard? I glanced back at the cabin, and suddenly it looked so far away, just a tiny light in the middle of all this darkness. Then I noticed something else. There were drag marks in the dirt, leading from the edge of the clearing to where he lay. Fresh drag marks. Whoever had left him here had done it recently. And that's when it hit me. Whoever had done this might still be nearby. I was standing out there, totally exposed, and I had no idea if I was alone. My flashlight was shaking in my hand as I turned and headed back to the cabin. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. The forest felt alive, every rustle in the leaves setting my nerves on edge. Once inside, I locked the door and sat there in the dark, my flashlight clutched tight in my hand. The night dragged on, every little noise outside making me jump. The wind, the branches tapping on the windows, it all felt too close, like something was just outside, waiting. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, heart pounding, until the first light of dawn started to creep in through the window. As soon as it was bright enough, I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and left without looking back. I didn't even want to see the graveyard as I passed by. I just wanted to get away from whatever was out there. Driving down the winding road, I couldn't shake the image of that body, those fresh drag marks in the dirt, or the feeling that someone had been watching me the whole time. And as I drove farther from the cabin, a thought crept into my mind that left a chill down my spine. Whoever had dragged that body to the graveyard hadn't wanted to bury it. They wanted it to be found, maybe by the next person who came out here. And as I sped down that road, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I'd stayed just one more night, they might have been watching me, waiting to see if I'd be the next body left in that silent, forgotten graveyard. My friend's grandmother had a small cabin way out in the woods, far from any road, miles from the nearest town. It was her getaway spot, a place to relax and escape from everything. My friend, who had just started working as a police officer, invited me to stay there for a weekend to clear my mind. She had gone a few times and told me it was peaceful, exactly what I needed. I thought that being alone in the woods would help me unwind. The cabin was basic, just one room with a bed, a little kitchen, and an old wood stove that kept things warm. There was no TV, no internet, and only weak cell service. The quiet was almost complete, with just the sounds of trees creaking and animals moving around in the brush. On my first day, everything went smoothly. I walked the trails nearby, enjoying the peace and quiet. But as night fell, the atmosphere changed. The woods, which had seemed so calm in the daytime, felt dark and heavy, like the trees were closing in on me. Every tiny sound, the crack of a twig or the rustle of leaves, felt louder and more intense in the darkness. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, but around midnight, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there with me, even though I knew the closest neighbor was miles away. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the quiet felt almost unnatural. The cabin had a few old lights that flickered, and I noticed one by the door blinking. At first, I thought it was just bad wiring, but then I saw something strange outside the window, a dim light moving in the trees. It was hard to see, but it looked like a small flashlight bobbing around in the forest. My stomach sank. There shouldn't be anyone out here at this hour, this far into the woods. I watched the light for a moment, hoping it would turn away, but it didn't. It kept coming closer, moving slowly through the trees, headed right for the cabin. I quickly turned off the lights inside, hoping the darkness would hide me. I moved to the back of the cabin, peeking out from a small window as the light approached. Soon, I could make out a figure holding the flashlight. They wore dark clothes and moved quietly, as if they were trying to sneak around. My heart raced as I wondered if they knew I was there. The figure stopped just outside the cabin, shining their flashlight across the walls, the windows, and the door. They stood there for what felt like an eternity, as if they were listening for something. I could hardly breathe, my mind racing. What were they doing there? What did they want? After a few minutes, they moved around to the side of the cabin, disappearing from view. I could hear their footsteps in the dirt, moving slowly like they were circling the place, checking every spot. I froze, trying to hear any sound, staying completely quiet. Then I heard a soft scraping noise at the back door, like someone was trying to handle. I backed away, my heart racing, glancing around for something to defend myself. There was an old iron poker by the fireplace, and I grabbed it, gripping it tightly. The cabin was so small that if they got in, I wouldn't have anywhere to hide. The scraping stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. But then I heard them walk back to the front of the cabin, their footsteps heavy and getting louder. I held my breath, feeling trapped in the small room. I kept thinking about my friend and how she joked that her grandmother had never had a problem out here. The footsteps finally faded, moving back into the trees. I stayed tense, barely breathing, for what felt like an hour, listening for any sign that they were still around. All I could hear was an occasional snap of a twig and the distant rustle of leaves. Eventually, the woods went quiet again, and I dared to hope they were gone. When dawn finally came, I hurried to pack my things. I stepped outside, looking around the trees, half expecting to see that figure watching me from the shadows. But there was no one there, just a heavy stillness hanging in the morning air. As I reached my car, I noticed something on the ground just outside the cabin door, a cigarette, but fresh and slightly crushed, left right by the entrance. I didn't smoke, and neither did my friend's grandmother. Whoever had been out there had left it behind, maybe as a warning. Driving back down the winding road, I couldn't shake the thought of that light moving through the trees, of someone creeping around the cabin in the dead of night, checking every window and every door. My gut told me that if I had stayed even one more night, that cigarette wouldn't have been the only thing left behind. And as I drove away, I felt a chill run down my spine, realizing that whoever had been out there was still watching. They had probably been waiting for someone to come along, just like I had. I could still feel their eyes on me, lurking just out of sight, and I knew that my peaceful escape had turned into something far more dangerous.